America's leading industry is still the manufacture, distribution, packaging, and marketing of bullshit.
With the government beholden to billionaires and real estate, or our vision for the future. We are done with empty promises wrapped up in flimsy packaging of dishonesty and corruption.
Feed the rich and feed the poor. This is class war.
You don't lose anything by losing faith, okay? What you gain is reality.
Red flags translate cognitive bias with critical thinking, the social norm of conformity, and how to spot the fake ally with reactionism. This is the first post in a subseries on cues in the day in and day out speech called Red Flags, under a larger series of bullshit and biases that covers critical thinking, cognitive biases, and the culture that causes them. The terminology in parlance gets passed around. Red flags usually comes with the attached meaning that whatever got this label was some kind of problem or a violation of a social norm. The first thing any of us has to do is clear the board, start with a blank slate, and rethink that word norm. The social norm. What social norm? Now, the problem is that social norms aren't exactly a static thing, nor are norms shared across regions or cultures. Norms change and die off, replaced with new ones all the time, just like slang and fashion choices. So too do our societal behaviors, and expectations change. But how often do we think about these changes, or the ones that control our behavior through expectations? Norms can even be as specific as what we learned at home in childhood. What one assumes is a norm may actually just be a bias that they acquired from life experience, and now are carrying that bias around in their subconscious as it controls their decisions and behaviors. Any of us should be scared of what our biases can do. Norm, noun, something that is usual, typical, or standard. If we consider the definition of the word, it's all centered around the idea that something is very elusive if we think about it. What is usual? What is typical? What is standard? What a lot of people may not realize is that these are arbitrary and emotional attachments, so let's not make any of this about group norms or their morals. So there's no reason to look at any of that, in my opinion. I don't really think that's at all too useful. May I suggest a couple of other metrics that actually overlap that we could consider looking at norms for red flags? How about what's healthy and what reduces harm? Because reducing harm is healthy for humans and societies as a byproduct. If you're okay with this, listen on. If not, well, consider why you want to be harmful and an unhealthy person. Because I'm being real with you. I do hope things get better for you. You wouldn't be feeling this way if something bad didn't happen in your life. Our own unique standard isn't going to be exactly the same as someone else's, and nor do you necessarily have a reason to enforce your standard on someone else, because there is no set standard, even if people made it seem like there was. We should ask, is what the person is doing causing harm? Not just asking if we feel like it's causing harm, because sometimes we might feel like someone is saying something harmful, but it's actually helpful, and it's our biases that make us unable to recognize that because of the norms that we learned. Our feelings aren't always reality, even if sometimes it totally feels like they are. They can be tricky like that. That's exactly how biases fool us, and we can't see them. Where dishonesty grows, authoritarian parenting. We live in a society where authoritarians have been training cycles of parents and children to enforce the social standard of obedience, even under the circumstances of irrational and unhealthy behavior. This was done through emotions and language. You never need to hit a child to scare them into submission. Among the first ways a child learns to yield to an unhealthy authority is the phrase, "because I said so." The most blatant of all moves to pull authority rank, no matter how irrational the adult's request was of the child. What it teaches in the earliest years is that logic is not required for action. It's the death of critical thinking before it can start. If we look at empathy, they force their norms onto others because they have unfortunately been taught that this is the right thing to do. It's how you live a successful life and get what you want from other people. But in reality, the method of cognitive biases and manipulations that they would learn from their parents' speech would become problems for their relationships and potentially put them in professional peril. This lack of critical thinking, the rationalization it spawns, and the problem it creates are passed down from parent to child almost as if it were a form of inheritance. Biases will set a person up for a lifetime of being a puppet, blind to what is really controlling their behavior. Before you think you should correct someone's tone, check yourself before you wreck yourself, because you're about to do an ad hom. If you didn't know what that is, check the podcast episode on it. It means that you're being irrational if you're more worried about tone than you are about the substance and the validity of what someone said or did. It doesn't matter if you've seen other people do it, they were being irrational too, and you might want to ask why they were being emotional. Let's just get it out of the way now. You don't get to enforce what makes you feel comfortable, because no one does, and people who are trying to show you one of the biggest red flags that you'll ever need to see. So maybe get over your attachment to norms now if you're here to catch the red flags of the unhealthy, the emotionally manipulative, and the greedy, because you better be ready to stick to the rules of logic and argumentation to do it. That's what critical thinking is. Norm doesn't really mean shit in the house of logic. Keep your eye on the ball of harm reduction and what is fair, and what could be proven as healthy by sciences like psychology, sociology, neuroscience, and biology. What's fair to you is what's fair to everyone else. Logic will help you keep consistency across thinking to spot unfair arguments, and the rules apply to all. We are rewarded by our own ethics and emotional discipline to be healthy, which makes us capable of seeing disjointed logic of others who are being unethical or struggling with emotions and ego through listening for logical fallacies and cognitive defense mechanisms. Those will show you the unhealthy signs in the outright manipulation, as biases are manipulations of facts or reality that the biased person may not even be aware that they have. Seeing red, a lens of bias. Biases and the manipulations that people craft to keep reinforcing that they're true indicate to you many potential warning signs about a person's mental health, as cognitive biases are a key factor in anxiety, depression, and personality disorders, among other mental health issues. During a conversation or disagreements, messaging and points to convey meaning are flying around between people. Due to limitations on language, we must think up a string of words that's going to make sense to the people listening to us, doing the best we can to match our meaning to what they also know. This doesn't always happen and results in miscommunication. People who are listening to us can receive what we say with a completely different meaning than what we intended, and it can start off a chain reaction. But why does this happen? Bias. Let me illustrate by telling a story about a not-so-nice boyfriend I had. He was quite insecure. At the time, he was working as a car salesman and was frustrated over his financial situation from not selling enough cars to pay his bills. In a moment of trying to uplift him and show confidence, I said, "You can do better next month," with the enthusiasm of a cartoon character cheerleader. He huffed at me. "Why do you think I don't try hard enough?" I was utterly confused in that moment. I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't say anything about his efforts, so why did he think that I did? This sort of situation shows a red flag in and of itself. This is where someone's worldview has crossed into distorting the meaning of the conversation. While I was attributing blame for his financial situations to the conditions at the dealership, slow sales, and small commissions, he assumed that I was attributing his financial failures to him and how hard he tried. In that moment, I knew he'd learned the world of neoliberalism, where we find ways to blame identity and social groups for every economic failure. Our entire sense of pride is hinged on our ability to make a successful life for ourselves, dubbed pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you can't, it means that you just didn't work hard enough. Well, that's the mantra of the neoliberal and the core of modern American culture. If he did not believe in individualism, he would have heard something different. He would have heard me blaming slow sales, but instead he chose to see me as the enemy, as someone who is just criticizing him. He created a nightmare all on his own. Would you ever want to stay with someone who makes you into a villain using their own worldview? The longer your conversation with someone continues, the more of their world will be revealed to you, and you may start to see their interwoven biases that hold together their perspective. It would pose a danger to you in the future. Insecurity is a red flag that reveals the truth. No matter how much they overcompensate, it's not healthy, even though sometimes you might hear people say, everyone has insecurities. Is it true? Well, to a large degree, yes. We are all going through these experiences of insecurities at some point in life, but they exist to be overcome. So if someone hasn't, that's the red flag. Sometimes it can be the very insecurity in a person's worldview, beliefs, education, or intelligence that's going to set the stage for all of these flags and the reactionary responses that follow. It's usually not just a few biases, but a whole web of them that weaves the narrative that they explain the world by. Around someone like this, a conversation is like a minefield, but bias exists to be overcome too. Humans are learning machines. Intellectual insecurity. Anti-intellectualism at its core is a very emotional experience that shows outwardly as disdain for academic institutions or the intellectuals who staff them. Another format is a rejection of science itself in exchange for religion, or the format known as unreflective instrumentalism, in which only practiced applied knowledge is worth time, so long as it can make money. It leaves the beholder crippled in conversations about culture, ideologies, and life experiences outside of their own. It's an echo chamber of one's own emotional comfort by never having to challenge what happens inside their heads. In this way, insecurity becomes the path to arrogance when those beliefs are challenged, only for the anti-intellectual to choose emotional weapons of logical fallacies to compete. All they might have is biases. And those are the red flags that anybody should be looking for. Perhaps the worst bias is that bias is unavoidable. Because of that bias, it just makes people intellectually lazier by believing in it. It's called the blind spot bias, in which people will often think that others are riddled with biases but overestimate their ability to catch their own. So they make excuses like saying bias is unavoidable to escape feeling obligations to learn more about bias. The bias blind spot is rooted in a broader cognitive bias called naive realism, or the belief that we see the world objectively. Ever heard the saying, everyone's a little bit racist before? There's literally a song titled that. That's a red flag. First, it's inaccurate. Not literally every last human being on Earth has an irrational fear of skin color. Second, it's a blind spot bias to excuse themselves by saying everyone else has blind spots. You should expect them to say racist things. They just told you who they were. They just made a false claim, using it as an excuse to act like a racist because they never wanted to spend time learning about racism. That's the uncomfortable truth that they won't admit to you, or perhaps even to themselves. The inaccurate and the irrational. If you intend on becoming a true detective of tracking down the red flags, there are two primary categories of flags, the inaccurate and the irrational. The inaccurate can be spotted by way of everyday speech. The person will casually drop some information that you could easily disprove with a Google search. This is easy to identify as a bias. It is also a person externalizing their feelings or beliefs as being real because the person thinks they are. The irrational is something that you'll see come up more often in disagreements because it will happen by way of the point that they're making not matching the situation. You might be asking them to change a bad habit that they've developed, but then suddenly you'll be defending yourself from their accusations about your bad habit to distract from the problem at hand. These can be more difficult to spot as it is a form of manipulation. It is both a bias and a massive red flag. There was an example of the inaccurate in the claim that everyone's a little bit racist, but what about the irrational? That could be seen in a different context in which a person of color is talking about racism, as the topic drifts into the harm that systemic bias does, or how they've been insulted by people who look white. The white person that they're talking to doesn't like that this talk about racism sounds angry and could use more polish on the wording. If the person of color made a rational point, then the white person is irrationally corrected a person of color for behavior, attacking the person of color's personality instead of talking about racism through something called an ad hominem, an error in logic that tone is all that matters. To believe tone matters might just make you a white supremacist. I hope that gave you a good reason to stop correcting people's tone for a social norm. Maybe you're just making an error in logic that was written down all the way back in 322 BC. Because what if your social norm is white supremacy or sexism or ableism or classism because no one can talk to you about things that you're uncomfortable with? Maybe it's time to rethink it, or you're going to end up like this guy. I blanked out the name because it's not great for him what I'm about to explain, and I ain't trying to ruin the guy's life because he's got a bias, one that's just as harmful for him to have as it is for people who have to put up with him. Red flags, fake ally spotting, the irony-pilled progressive hypocrite. Here's a common misconception. It's always good to stand up for yourself if you feel insulted. Might want to red flag that, because how do you know what they're going to interpret as an insult? Though it may not be immediately apparent to someone, one of the contained clauses of white supremacy included in the package deal is the right to comfort, also known as privilege. It's the first-class upgrade if you have the position of power to obtain it. Now, that's not just being white, but also a man, straight, able-bodied, Christian, and above all, if you're rich. You can use privilege across the spectrum, no limits, like it's a fast pass at Disney. It's all catered to be about your personal enjoyment. It's all about the default in society. If one is a capital owner, or the supporter of capital owners, it's easy to shout down a socialist as being naive and stupid when defending the default economic system. If one is a man, it's easy to put down a woman and not listen to her criticism. If one is able-bodied, they don't have to give a shit about disabled people struggling. It's the ability not to care about anything but what affects them, because it's an inconvenience and there's no inconvenience allowed. The default always gets to strut around the board, acting like a pigeon who thinks it's won by following the white supremacist social norm. That's reactionism. Reactionism is inherently a right-wing ideology. The goal of the ideology is to keep the status quo. In America, we don't think of liberals as a right-wing, but the rest of the world, American liberal policies overlap with what's considered right-wing. The entire capitalist spectrum, from social democrat to conservative libertarian, is still right-wing. And it's why even Bernie bros might attack your identity to defend economics or their position of power using intellectual overpowering to do it. They have to defend the default and attack your identity to do it, because if there's a legitimate criticism about their system and they don't want to hear it, you're insulting them. The reason for this is classic liberalism, which is paired with all capitalist believers. Included in the package deal is a cognitive thought process of individualism. This individualism process is why identity becomes an important thing to attack. People who believe in individualism think identity is concretely real and fundamentally misunderstand what it is, and it creates this fragile ego you see. If you didn't think identity was important, you wouldn't find yourself using it as an argumentation point and end up doing a logical fallacy. Ask yourself why identity is important to you, because maybe, if you don't need it, you'll see a whole new world when you ask, if identity doesn't explain something, what does? So I'm about to challenge a liberal's white supremacist social norm, that we aren't all put on this planet to manage each other's feelings because it's scientifically impossible even if we try to be as nice as we can. And watch, he's going to defend the default social norm by insisting that a person's tone is all that matters, and that is an identity attack by ad hominem, specifically tone policing. He wants to avoid learning about his white supremacist social norm, so look, it's just easy enough to take it out on a woman who's questioning your authoritative norm. Act like a sexist, and prove that your social norm is a system of privilege. Liberals are often accusing conservatives of not taking criticism, but then look at what happens when you confront one of them about how we're all supposed to be responsible for our emotions and focus on rationality. Nope, fuck logic. It's all about the feelings. So I'll just read off his original post here. People conflate insulting with criticizing are already halfway to brainwashed. The left invites criticism so long as it isn't insulting. The right considers all criticism to be insulting even when that criticism is warranted. Don't stomp around normalizing the idea that all criticism equals insult. That represents a patriarchal mindset. So, I thought I was agreeing with him when I said back, those who cry about their feelings are so much self-reporting. Criticism can be awesome, actually, even if someone did scream it at you while being insulting. Tone doesn't dictate whether or not something's a valid point. You could totally just have gotten the best advice you'll ever get. Gonna let the feelings get in the way? And the next morning, I get this back. Nope, people can offer their criticism in a way that's respectful, always. We don't have to take abuse from anyone. Well, if everything is about insults and feelings, then rationality doesn't matter. Do facts either then? What if those are insulting? Can I say those? The line is, people can offer their criticism in a way that's respectful always. Well, this is tone policing. That's it, nothing more. A valid point is valid. Tone policing is a tactic to distract or deny criticism, a tactic used by reactionaries to push back on social justice and economic equality for hundreds of years. Ad hominem, adjective, of an argument or reaction directed against a person rather than the position they are maintaining. He's focusing on the person's tone or insults, not the criticism. If you listen to his advice, you're setting yourself up to be entitled to respect, even if that would be irrational and can have unintended consequences. Side effects such as making yourself miserable with expectations or bullying marginalized people when they criticize something that you're doing. That is reactionism, and this fellow just lost his logic. So, while I understand with our current culture that we may have this immediate snap reaction to think that we should never tolerate someone being rude to us or abusive, and I agree, it isn't something that people should ever subject themselves to as a pattern, it's also entirely rational to avoid harmful behavior. But one thing that we should also understand, a valid point is a valid point. There is no getting around that, no matter how rude or abusive it was delivered. It would benefit us to accept what is valid. However, it would also be perfectly okay to leave the room after that because your debate opponent is being irrationally abusive themselves by tacking on unnecessary rhetoric. If that's not for you, head out. I already understand that debate often comes with a dose of emotional abuse. It's almost inevitable if you're trying to talk someone down off their radicalization. Harmful beliefs involve emotions, and those come out as they struggle with their ideas. It's neurotransmitters at work. I expect every person who is struggling with anxiety from their biases to attack and insult me because they've been taught to do that from childhood. Don't worry, I'm fine for all the concern trolls. Since I manage my own feelings and understand the psychology of people who weaponize identity, their identity attacks are just information. Part of the debate that tells me what biases that they believe in that explain their illogical arguments. What they believe about identity is why they have an anxiety problem. I don't have to make it about me. I can focus on their ideas, and that's how you often end up catching them in errors. If I really thought that it was appropriate to back down from a tiny insult, I would never be effective in arguing someone out of an idea that's been harming their mental health for decades. That's the only real reason to argue. But you must also know when to just drop it, because their neurotransmitters won't let them learn, and so just let them be wrong. If you choose to ignore a valid point due to tone, you will only delude yourself from reality by way of cognitive defense mechanism, denial or rationalization. You will be lying to yourself. Not a skill one should practice, or they risk losing touch with what's real if it's practiced too often. We have a belief in society that we have this right to comfort, happiness, and respect. These would all be fine in theory if it were entirely possible to control the behaviors or miscommunications, but it's scientifically impossible. Neuroscience says that there's limits no matter how accommodating that we can try to be with our verbiage. Sugarcoating may not prevent aggro from someone's ego. Always is a quantifier that's absolute. Like always, never, all, nothing. This is a known sign of a cognitive process referred to as black and white thinking that can jack up somebody's critical thinking, perhaps a sign that his is not very good at this point. His claim is insensitive to people with Tourette's or anyone with dysregulated brain wiring. I'm sure zero patience for people struggling with depression. He's leaving out all these deterministic reasons that a person might be impacted by biology or disease. He must assume that they have a free choice. Not only that, what this man can be offended over is entirely up to his individual template of life experience. Yet he expects other people to know how to avoid offending him by researching his life history at the level of a therapist. How embarrassing. No one can control how you feel, but a manipulator will tell you that you can control how they feel, so it's your fault if they hit you. No one can control ideas that offend you. That's a limitation of the human perception in neuroscience, but this guy thinks that you can, like magic. That is externalization. This is the same correspondence bias that conservatives and Christians have often used to judge people's identities harshly, using a belief system of absolute free will and punishing people for situations beyond their control. He is a hypocrite using the same idea set that they do, capable of being very biased and cruel. He shouldn't be arrogant about his knowledge of mental health and mansplain it to someone who has a career in behavioral economics. That looks like he's a sexist who should have thought of that before he told a woman to continue believing in a social norm that forces her to manage his feelings of being insulted when criticized. That is patriarchy. That's exactly how codependency is created, by the expectation that people were only put on this earth to make you comfortable. He's actually teaching women to accept abuse, not stand up to it. By teaching people that we must manage each other's feelings externally, instead of internally processing cognitive reappraisal used in CBT, we're teaching people to accept manipulation and abuse. He's managed to contradict his original post within hours. That's talent. Being worried about insults can make one trip on their own sexism while being ironic about other people's patriarchal mindset. None of us are entitled to respect as a default, so you might as well stop caring about it now, or you'll just piss yourself off expecting it. I won't be taking his advice. I'll stick to being fair to my fellow humans even if my feelings were a little scuffed by how they put it. If I was worthy of criticism for being unfair, then I was. Who am I to determine the standard of delivery? Oh, and I think it's interesting that some people think they do. If you are just getting here, thanks for checking out the Substack and the YouTube. Please do consider recent content on logical fallacies and critical thinking, as it may help you better understand what you heard within this podcast. Last week was all the introduction to ad hominems, which included a short section on tone policing that was detailed above, along with more abuser tactics. The week before, I talked a little bit about power dynamics of politics being used as control in relationships, which is also relational to the sexism demonstrated in this post about red flags. This is a continuing series about critical thinking, cognitive biases, and the culture that causes them.